Thank you, Saida, for those very kind words of introduction. Thank you also to the Melaka In Fact team for all your efforts to make this afternoon possible. I should, however, qualify a little bit about Saida's very, very kind and generous introduction. I think most importantly, the last time I formally studied history was when I was 13 years old, in Form 3, and I have no formal qualifications at all. So it is very kind of you to invite me to be here today. What I would like to do over the next few minutes I have with you is to try to think through with you a little bit about the significance of many of the issues raised about Melaka. Thank you very much for adjusting this microphone. It allows me not to stoop as I tend to do too much. Now you all know what it's like to be a pain in the neck. In any case, I think it is useful for us to think about many things about the world and where we live in this world, and to think about, as I suggest up here, about questions of trade, governance, foreign affairs, socioeconomic relations, cultural identity, Islam, and so on. This long 15th Christian era century, which I'm going to focus on, I think it raises a lot of issues. It raises a lot of issues about these other issues. So I'm not going to go into history. The serious historians among you are going to be terribly disappointed with what I have to say, but in terms of enhancing your knowledge about history. But I do think it is useful for us, and this is, I think, very much part of the ethos which has inspired Melaka In Fact, for us to think about what all this implies for in terms of the making of our nation, of our place in the world, in the past as well as going forward. And there are basically three parts to what I'm going to try to talk about. I'm going to reflect a little bit about the long 15th century, as I call it. I'm also going to say a little bit about what some of the questions raised about Islam, and also a little bit about what is called Malay identity. Let me begin 5 centuries earlier, almost half a millennium earlier, with the recent exhibit of something called the Tang shipwreck. The Tang shipwreck is a misnomer. It should be called the Bilitong shipwreck. The ship concerned was not built in China during the Tang dynasty, as its name implies, but it did sink off Bilitong Island during the Tang era. Okay. And carrying a cargo which was significantly, had quite a number of Chinese products, most of which have disappeared over time, at least those which were of organic materials. So it's the inorganic stuff which has remained, mainly ceramics. This Tang shipwreck was known to Kerpang farmers of what could be referred to as sea cucumbers, for a long time, because it sank on a sandbar. But during the time of the Asian crisis, which as some of you know, I wrote a great deal about, during the time of the Asian crisis, a commercial salvage archaeological company went in, made a deal to excavate and take out and recover it. As a consequence of this, that shipwreck and what has been recovered will never be exhibited in any serious museum in the world. Nonetheless, I think it raises very important questions for us to reflect on, and about what the world was like more than a millennium ago. And this map reminds you of some of the trade which was being plied in a world which was really around Asia and East Africa. It doesn't mean there was nothing else going on in the rest of the world, but it was really a world of Asia and East Africa at that time. And this boat, the Tang shipwreck boat, was built probably in Oman, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, and it had sailed from Oman, from the Persian Gulf, up to northeast China, unloaded its largely Persian cargo, I presume, considering the sophistication of Persian products of that period, and then taken Chinese goods on board and had gone down to a place called Sailendra. Sailendra, the name of Southeast Asia. If you think of the Nusantara at that time, there were basically two parts. What we refer to as Srivijaya, and east of Srivijaya, meaning from Sunda onwards, basically you had a Java-based empire known as Sailendra. Now, this ship came down on its way to Java and sank on this sandbar. And what has been recovered is of course quite interesting. As I said, it will never be exhibited in any self-respecting museum in the West. But Malaysia has a claim to it, because the two halves of what was recovered, half of it went to the company, which was sold. The other half went to the Indonesian government. And the then government of Indonesia, I think under President Habibie, sold off this half which they had preserved to the Kutek Puat Trust. Now, for those of you who are too young to remember, the Kutek Puat was the man running the Malayan banking when there was a run on the bank, and Bank Negara intervened to save Malayan banking in the 1960s. And Kutek Puat subsequently made a fortune in Singapore, and the Kutek Puat Trust owned this and has allowed it to be exhibited in Singapore. So this exhibition, there is now a coffee table book which tells us a little bit about it, but I think what is most interesting is the world of Southeast Asia at that time as we know it. And I think it's very useful for us to reflect very briefly on the sophistication of some of the products which were found from that day. So this, for example, is a beautiful item which was found, and you can see the sophistication and aesthetic sophistication and as well as the fine craftsmanship of this product and of this product as well. And we're talking about something which was probably produced about 1100 years ago, 11 centuries ago. Now, let me now switch to how the world was seen in those days. And I'm going to show you a series of maps and how the world was understood and seen by others in that time. This, for example, is a map which most of us can barely recognize. That island which says Ceylon, it refers to Ceylon, okay? You will see that something referring to Malacca, slightly east of that. So Sumatra has basically disappeared, okay? And there's Java Minor there. So that's one view of the world at that time. And yet another view is provided here. I don't want to detain you too much on this, but I just want to show you how the world was seen in those days. And here you see Malacca, spelt in a very interesting way, which looks more like a mocha drink than some marketing ideas for those of you who are so inclined. And then this is yet another map. Okay, so we have attempts to see this world, but by the standards of our time, of course, these are very, very crude attempts. Okay, and this you can see the relative size of Sumatra, Tabro, Bana, and Malacca, spelled differently this time, M-A-L-L-A-Q-A. And this is yet another view of the world. And you can see there are many, many others in different collections of maps, which are interesting. This is a map from of China, and from Chinese source, of course, and this is by way of a prelude to the Ming expeditions. Now, the Ming expeditions are interesting because they were rather brief, and Malaysian-born Australian who grew up in Malaysia, Jeffrey Wade, has done translations of the of much of the chronicles of that period. In his PhD thesis, I think 11 volumes are appendices dedicated to this period. Okay, and also, of course, we know about the voyages of Cheng Ho, and his seven voyages. He dies on the last voyage, and his major chronicler, of course, was Ma Huan. Now, basically, this is a prelude to emphasizing that the nature of trade at that time was essentially of twofold. Okay, so you have what we might term today regional trade, trade within the region, and then you had the advent, not a recent advent, mind you, centuries-old advent of what might be termed long-distance trade. And some of you who may have read the Egyptian economist Samir Amin, who passed away late last year, Samir talks about long-distance trade comparably to Joseph Stiglitz, who talks about the asymmetry of information. And in long-distance trade, you have the same asymmetry of information, that the two trading partners really do not know the cost of production. And so you are able to negotiate on the basis of mutual ignorance. But that mutual ignorance is crucial to securing advantage in that transaction. And so power becomes important as well, and relative power. So power is information, power is knowledge, but power is more than that, or just that. And this, I think, is very important for us to begin to recognize. Now, Datin Saida raised the question of Malacca in relation to Singapore. As you know, this year will be the celebration, the reminder of the end of the version of Singapore's history according to the late Lee Kuan Yew. For Mr. Lee, the late Mr. Lee, history begins, Singapore's history began in 1819. And that too, by the way, is factually incorrect, because the deal Mr. Raffles made, or later Sir Stamford, made in 1819 was a deal to open a factory for the East India Company in Singapore. It was not more than that. It did not give him proprietary rights and so on. But with the subsequent end of the Napoleonic Wars, you have in 1824 the Anglo-Dutch Treaty, and that Anglo-Dutch Treaty is, of course, quite crucial, because it basically begins the period of war by other means. So rivalries between the British, the UK and the Dutch. Remember that the era of the glory of the Dutch Empire, the glory of the Dutch Republic, I emphasize, a Dutch Republic, was earlier, and that ended with the domination of the House of Orange in what we now call the Netherlands. The House of Orange, at that time, the House of Orange was no more than the stadtholder, okay? The stadtholder, a term which was used later when the Dutch VOC dominated, or Dutch East India Company dominated Malacca. Okay, so these terms are all reminiscent, but they tell us a lot about the relationships of power and the presumption that the Dutch royal house today is an age-old royal house is actually a false presumption. It was something which has been relatively recently created on the ruins of the Dutch Republic, if you will. But the question then arises, 15th century Singapore. At the beginning of the 15th century, according to the revisionist version of Singapore history, which is now emerging thanks to the archaeological work of people like John Mixick and others, the claim now is that Singapore was a thriving port before the 15th Christian century. The question then we have to ask ourselves is, why did Cheng Ho come and not build on an existing port of Singapore, and instead moved on first to Palembang and then to Malacca and build up Malacca? This, I think, is a very interesting choice because there are echoes of it in the last few years, when China, with the Belt and Road Initiative, is also made a choice to begin with Malaysia and bypass Singapore. And this, I think, is very, very important for us to reflect on how international affairs seems to have changed so radically over the last 5 centuries. But yet, there are important parallels and choices and options which are open to us precisely because of certain parallels which history reminds us of. I think this is a very, very important question to ask ourselves, and it's especially important to ask ourselves today in terms of our conduct of international affairs. 52 years ago, the late Tun Razak, together with other ministers, agreed to make Southeast Asia a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. Is that option something which is still relevant for us today? I happen to be one of a group of people who actually remains committed to what is referred to as ZOC-FUN, but there are many people who would choose otherwise, including the Singapore government, which has chosen to work with Japan, Australia, and others to try to join the encirclement of China. Huawei and the Huawei episode is only part of a larger challenge, the beginnings of a new Cold War, if you will. And where do we want to locate ourselves in relation to this new Cold War? What are the choices available? Do we want to take sides? Do we want to take sides together with the West, led by the US? Or to side with China? Or to remain neutral? Not in a passive way, but in an active way. These are the choices which are still relevant for us today, as they must have been for Parameswara when he decides to become Iskandar Shah and build up the Malacca Sultanate. And so this brings me to the next question. Questions of polity, of governance. How did Iskandar Shah and his successors build up Malacca? Why did Malacca grow during that fateful century? Why? And I think it's very useful for us to remember, if you reflect on how Malacca was organized, the polity of Malacca, to reflect a little bit on the Shah Banda. We often presume that, Shah Banda sounds pretty important, there must have been one Shah Banda. But in the case of Malacca, there were not one, not two Shah Banda, not three Shah Banda, but 4. Now, this particular map is very interesting. For those of you who have read the late Janet Abu Lughod, who, by the way, was the wife of Ibrahim Abu Lughod, the Palestinian scholar who was identified as part of the evil influences on the candidate named Barack Obama in 2008. Janet Abu Lughod, who started life as a historian of Egypt, and Chowdhury independently, they look at the world in the 14th Christian century, and they saw a world in this part, around Asia, South and East Asia, if you will, and of three major circuits, spheres of influence, or whatever you might want to call them. One around the Arab world, including the Horn of Africa, arguably parts of East Africa as well, extending to the west coast of what might be termed the Indian subcontinent. Then another circuit, if you will, around India, but also involving Southeast Asia, especially the western part of Southeast Asia. And yet a third circuit involving what might loosely be referred to as East Asia, extending from China down south to Southeast Asia. What did the Sultan do? He said, this makes sense, but I want to go one further. Let me distinguish between the regional trade of Southeast Asia from Northeast Asia, if you will. And what does he do? So he appoints 4 Shah Bandar. He appoints a Chinese to look after all look after Northeast Asia. He appoints a Javanese, and just remember that the Javanese are quite distinct in those days. Yeah? They're not, they're not part of the Malay world in the sense that we currently understand it. He appoints a Javanese as the Shah Bandar for Southeast Asian trade. He appoints, their bearing accounts, a Bengali or Tamil, to handle the trade around the Bay of Bengal. And then he appoints a Gujarati Muslim to handle points further west. So he takes this world as he inherits it, but he refines it. He modifies the governance of trade to his purposes. Let me now move very quickly to some brief consideration of 3 issues relating to, for want of a better term, matters Islamic.